America in the 1960s was going through radical cultural changes. The stuffy conservative image of the 1950s was quickly giving way to liberalism and the reassessment of what it meant to be an American. Teenagers especially enjoyed new freedoms, new entertainment, and new ideas, while the civil rights movement began to gain more and more traction. It was against this backdrop of a changing America that people began to question American policies more than they had done before. When the US began its bombing campaign against the North, a number of American students, mostly those of a left-wing persuasion, began protesting on college campuses. These early protests were largely ignored by the wider public, who in 1965 still supported military intervention in Vietnam. But over the years, the number of dissenting voices would grow and include people from all walks of life. This was something of a shock to Johnson's government and the military leadership, who in the past had enjoyed wide-scale patriotic support for defending Americans' interests overseas. One of the biggest factors of this change in tone was the widespread coverage of the conflict on television. For the first time, people would finish their day's work or studies, come home for dinner, and then sit around the TV watching the news, which beamed footage of the horrors of what was happening in Vietnam straight into American living rooms. It was almost impossible to escape the broadcasts, and as a result, it was almost impossible not to form an opinion. Protest marches grew and grew until October 21st, 1967. Some 100,000 protesters gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. Of this group, around 30,000 of them proceeded to march on the Pentagon later that night, resulting in a brutal confrontation, with soldiers and US Marshals protecting the building. Hundreds of demonstrators were arrested, and many more injured, which only fueled further resentment for the war. At the same time, the anti-war movement raised racial issues in American society, especially over the draft of black men to serve in the armed forces. Some were angry that society didn't offer the black communities of America the same opportunities that the white Americans enjoyed. As such, they had fewer grounds to avoid the draft. Others in the civil rights movement pointed out that the US government wanted black men to go halfway around the world to fight for the rights of another country's people, when their own rights in America were still being curtailed. Without doubt, the most famous case of opposition on these grounds was boxer Muhammad Ali, who lost his boxing license and was threatened with imprisonment when he refused military service. In 1967, Martin Luther King became a powerful ally to the anti-war movement when he openly voiced his opposition on moral grounds, condemning the war's diversion of federal funds from domestic programs, as well as the disproportionate number of African American casualties in relation to the total number of soldiers killed in the war. Nevertheless, there was still a strong majority who supported the war by 1968, and confidence was still high of final victory. However, American resilience at all levels was about to be tested more than ever before. With Rolling Thunder failing to achieve its goal of forcing the North Vietnamese to negotiate, the fighting in South Vietnam ground to brutal stalemate, composed predominantly of regional engagements by the Viet Cong and NVA, using the Ho Chi Minh Trail to bypass American and South Vietnamese defences near the DMZ. The Americans were able to aggressively pursue their enemy in South Vietnam, but they proved a most elusive foe, being able to effectively disappear into the dense jungle. By July 1967, the North Vietnamese leadership believed the time was right for a major engagement with the South and their American allies. Recognizing the turbulent political situation in Saigon, South Vietnam, having had 3 more leadership changes in 2 years, and the growing discontent over the war in the United States, they speculated that if enough pressure was put on the Americans, they would no longer be able to maintain the war effort, at least at its present level, without severe political ramifications for President Johnson's Democratic Party. With American support wavering, the troubled government in Saigon would collapse, leaving the country unable to rally a defense and eventually fall. As many as 85,000 men were readied for the major offensive, to lure the South into false sense of security. In October 1967, the North announced that it would observe a 7-day truce starting on January 27, 1968, and ending on February 3rd, in order to observe the Vietnamese New Year, known as Tet. In reality, it was during the middle of this holiday that the communists would strike, but in the days leading up to the ceasefire, neither the American or South Vietnamese intelligence agencies had any indication of what was happening. To that end, after the truce was called, large numbers of South Vietnamese forces were allowed on leave, meaning they were away from their units when the attack finally came. Shortly after midnight on January 30th, 1968, the UN Saigon, the Viet Cong had 6 primary targets to capture, namely the headquarters of the ARVN and Navy Ton Son Nhu Air Base, the Independence Palace, the US Embassy, and the National Radio Station. The Viet Cong planned to capture a number of South Vietnamese tanks they believed were based at the Army's Armoured Forces headquarters, but these tanks had been moved 2 months earlier. At the National Radio Station, the attackers attempted to broadcast a recording of Ho Chi Minh calling for the people of the city to rise up in support of the communists, but they failed and died when they destroyed the building around them, rather than be captured. A 19-man team attempted to capture the US Embassy but were overpowered. As the city's defenders began to wrestle back control, the Viet Cong began fanning out, attacking a number of homes of government officials and military personnel who were on a blacklist. On the morning of February 1st, the chief of the National Police publicly executed a Viet Cong officer captured in civilian clothing. The image being captured by photographer Edward T. Adams and another cameraman. Adams's image would win the 1969 Pulitzer Prize for spot news photography. The Viet Cong also carried out a series of atrocities across the country against civilians who they felt could not be re-educated to the communist way or remained loyal to the government in Saigon. This included the massacre of up to 6,000 civilians and captured South Vietnamese soldiers during the Battle of Hue. Days before the Tet Truce was called, the US Marine garrison, based at Khe Sanh near the Laos border, came under an artillery barrage. This barrage signalled the start of the Siege of Khe Sanh, a 77-day battle that was one of the longest and bloodiest engagements of the whole conflict. For the NVA and the Viet Cong, the siege stirred memories of their triumph against the French at Dien Bien Phu and dreams of achieving a similar success against the Americans. Unlike the French in 1954, the US had awe-inspiring firepower at their disposal to repel the attacks on the base, including using B-52 strategic bombers to level huge areas of jungle, and flying gunships such as the AC-47. As the siege grew on, the intense bombing made parts of the surrounding landscape begin to look like the surface of the moon, with the vegetation having been wiped out and the ground being littered with craters. Back in Washington, a model of the base was constructed for use in briefing President Johnson on the situation. In April, a joint operation by the US Army, Marines, ARVN, dubbed Operation Pegasus, fought their way to the garrison, freeing the Marines there and ending the siege. However, what should have been a cause for celebration was met with criticism from the US public and their politicians, who questioned the wisdom of choosing to defend the base, rather than just pull the Marines out of danger. As the fighting dragged on in the wake of the Tet Offensive, a tragedy would occur that would cause far-reaching damage to US prestige and world opinion. When US troops from the 23rd Infantry Division carried out the mass murder of unarmed civilians in Son Tin district of South Vietnam on March 16, 1968, as many as 504 unarmed people were killed, including men, women and children, and in some cases even infants, while girls as young as 12 were gang raped before being shot in and around the village of My Lai. 26 soldiers were charged with criminal offences, but only Lieutenant William Calley Jr. was found guilty of killing 22 villagers. He was originally given a life sentence, but served only 3.5 years under house arrest. It would not be until November 1969 that the story was released to the public, only adding fuel to the anti-war sentiment in the United States. Ultimately, the Tet Offensive was a failure for the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. Breaking from their cover, they were simply overwhelmed by superior American firepower, and so they returned to their guerrilla style of warfare back in the countryside. However, in an ironic twist, the Tet Offensive would provide the Communists with their greatest political victory. The dramatic rise in US casualties during the offensive finally began to wear down the US people's resolve to continue the war. This was demonstrated in the New Hampshire primary, when 42% of the Democratic vote went to Eugene McCarthy, who campaigned on a platform promising to pull all American troops out of Vietnam. Johnson only marginally defeated him, achieving 49%, but it was clear that things had to change. Johnson's government was already looking at meeting with North Vietnamese in peace talks, and as a gesture to encourage this, he ordered first a drawdown of Operation Rolling Thunder, and eventually ordering a suspension which ended airstrikes against North Vietnam. On March 31, 1968, he spoke to the public regarding future measures to limit American involvement in the Vietnam War. During the speech he would say, "I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president." US public opinion for support of the war had plummeted down to just 26%, with around 30,000 Americans having died in Vietnam between 1961 and 1968. And Johnson would be forced to assume responsibility as the 1968 elections loomed. The Democratic were defeated, and into the White House stepped Republican Richard M. Nixon, leaving Johnson to stand down with the legacy of having been the man who led America into the most disastrous war to date, ignoring the fact he had inherited the situation in Vietnam from Kennedy, who was still a much-loved figure in the US. Nixon had campaigned on a promise to get the 500,000 US troops, airmen and sailors out of Vietnam, one way or another, but he secretly confided to colleagues that in his opinion the war could not be won, at least in a military context. He did believe, however, that he could convince the North Vietnamese to sue for peace if he projected an image of a man who was volatile and unstable, what he referred to as the madman theory, and which was the exact opposite of the rather tepid view the world had of Johnson. Regardless of how the North viewed Nixon, he was determined to start drawing down US forces in Vietnam, but he was also adamant to do so in a way that didn't make it appear as an American defeat. He continued efforts to negotiate with the North Vietnamese in Paris, but insisted that they had to include the South Vietnamese government, which Hanoi initially refused to recognize. The North Vietnamese resolve only hardened when on September 2, 1969, their great leader Ho Chi Minh died after years of ailing health. They now wanted victory in order to honor the man they saw as having freed them. At the same time as pursuing peace talks, Nixon instigated a policy of Vietnamization regarding combat operations, in which more training and equipment would be supplied to the ARVN to allow them to begin replacing the initial US units being sent home in 1969. Leading this increasingly leaner US force was General Creighton Abrams, who replaced Westmoreland in June 1968. Westmoreland had repeatedly been at odds with Johnson's administration by that time, as he had been calling for ground operations to be expanded into Cambodia and Laos to finally shut down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and strangle the communist forces in the south. In one of the more shocking revelations to come out later, it was discovered that he had ordered preparations to be made for nuclear weapons to be readied as a contingency plan under Operation Fracture Jaw, something the White House put a stop to immediately once they learned of it. Johnson wouldn't expand the war, but Nixon was more than willing to. In March 1969, following a new communist offensive, Nixon ordered USAF B-52s to launch a campaign against the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia. But controversially, without congressional or even Cambodian permission, flight logs were even altered to conceal the bomber crew's missions. A year later, US and South Vietnamese troops finally went on the offensive against Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army positions in Cambodia. The CIA-sponsored coup in Cambodia saw Cambodian troops finally engage the communist troops in their country, after years of turning a blind eye. All this widened the scope of the war, but in doing so further infuriated the anti-war movement at home, leading to violence at demonstrations on US college campuses especially. During a protest at Kent State University in Ohio on May 4, 1970, violence erupted between protesters and National Guardsmen, resulting in 4 protesters being shot dead. For many who completed their first tours of duty, the dream of returning home often soared when they saw the often hostile reception waiting for them, such as being spat upon at airports by protesters. In many cases, this saw some of these men volunteer for a second tour. The unrest at home filtered back to US forces who weren't part of the initial withdrawal. Deep-rooted divisions amongst race, class, and even religious backgrounds all came to the surface, leaving many US units lacking military cohesion and, in many cases, basic military discipline. In the period between 1969 and 1971, there was a staggering 700 recorded assaults on officers by soldiers, and at least 83 resulted in the officer being killed. The situation was exacerbated by widespread drug abuse amongst the ranks, and with US combat operations becoming more defensive in nature through 1970 and 1971, 4 times as many soldiers were treated in army hospitals for the effects of drug abuse than from combat with the enemy. With more and more US troops being withdrawn, the general mood was that no one wanted to be remembered as the last man to die in Vietnam. For the South Vietnamese armed forces, Vietnamization of the fighting saw their numbers swell dramatically thanks to greater investment in weapons and training by the Americans and widespread drafting of men to fill their ranks. At one point, the South Vietnamese Air Force had an inventory of aircraft that would make it the 4th largest in the world, although these were mostly light ground attack types and a handful of supersonic jets, such as the Northrop F-5 Freedom Fighter. It was time for the rejuvenated new ARVN and the policy of Vietnamization itself to be tested. On February 8, 1971, they undertook Operation Lam Son 719, which saw 20,000 troops supported by tanks and helicopters strike out in Laos to attack the Ho Chi Minh Trail and destroy NVA regional command posts. US forces would be limited to providing air support, only since Congress had now banned the use of US ground forces outside of South Vietnam itself. The operation was a disaster. Numbers of casualties vary depending on the source, but some claim as many as 8,000 South Vietnamese were killed, while tanks and helicopters were left abandoned in the field. The Lam Son 719 disaster did not inspire confidence that the South Vietnamese would be able to defend themselves when the US finally withdrew, and this made brokering a peace deal especially important. With negotiations in Paris, and some behind-the-scenes talks having stalled, Nixon instead decided to approach the Soviet Union and China for help in encouraging the North Vietnamese to agree to a peace settlement. Like the US, neither Beijing nor Moscow wanted the war to go on any longer, although neither were willing to suspend arms shipments to North Vietnam. This would eventually lead to President Nixon making a historic visit to China in 1972, the first sitting US president to do so, where among other things they discussed putting pressure on Hanoi to end the war. The North Vietnamese refused to listen. By January 1972, of the 500,000 US troops in Vietnam when he came to office, Nixon had now dwindled that number to around 130,000, and most of the fighting against the communists was done by the ARVN. The US still maintained powerful air, naval, and artillery forces in South Vietnam to support the South Vietnamese, but they themselves mainly took a defensive posture, save for a number of advisors who joined the ARVN on operations. Spurred on by the ARVN's poor showing in Laos, the North Vietnamese army decided on a bold, new offensive in 1972 that was unlike any they had attempted before. Like in Tet, they would once again break cover and engage the ARVN and any American units they encountered in a pitched battle. The difference this time, however, was that rather than a predominantly infantry force, the North Vietnamese army would utilize large numbers of tanks, giving them their own heavy firepower to bring down the enemy. The vast majority of tanks at their disposal was Soviet-supplied T-54s and amphibious PT-76s, which would provide invaluable in crossing rivers, but they also included a number of World War II vintage T-34/85s. The offensive began on March 30th, 1972, with a 30,000-man thrust across the DMZ and from Laos. On April 5th, 20,000 more communist troops had attacked from Cambodia, by which time Nixon had sanctioned a response in the form of the resumption of the bombings of North Vietnam by American aircraft, aimed at distributing the supply line to the communist forces in the south. Unlike the previous Rolling Thunder campaign, the new campaign would not forbid attacks on the port city of Haiphong, where a great deal of the Soviet equipment was being delivered. US planes would drop 11,000 mines in the entrance to Haiphong and other harbours, distributing some 85% of North Vietnamese military imports. The next targets were rail yards and railway bridges that led to China, and this saw the first use of laser-guided bombs in the war, when they were dropped by F-4 Phantoms against the Hanwei Bridge on April 27th. Nixon then authorised a more comprehensive campaign aimed at isolating North Vietnam from outside supplies, and destroying its ability to store and transport supplies to the front lines in the south. 414 missions were flown on the first day of Operation Linebacker alone, and once again the North Vietnamese Air Force rose to meet the American attackers. Now, however, the situation was far less in their favour, with the US Navy pilots especially having been fully retrained, not just in air-to-air combat, but specifically to combat the MiGs fielded by the NVAF. US forces were down 11 MiGs on the first day in the most intense air combat of the war, but by no means was the MiG threat negated, with the NVAF shooting down 5 F-4s on May 10th. The impact of Linebacker was almost immediately felt in the south, as the communist forces became starved of ammunition, fuel and supplies. As much as 70% of supplies earmarked for the offensive were either destroyed or stopped from reaching the forces at the front, who were already themselves the subject of intense aerial bombardment, and by the summer the offensive had stalled. The North Vietnamese once again returned to peace talks, and Nixon ordered that airstrikes now be limited to south of the 20th parallel. Over the coming months, US National Security Advisor Dr. Henry Kissinger and North Vietnamese Politburo member Lee Duc-tho would meet in Paris to discuss peace terms. Among the terms discussed was a pledge by the North to stop sending its forces south and release a number of US POWs. The US agreed to withdraw all its forces and establish a power-sharing agreement in the south between the Viet Cong and the Saigon government. It looked as though peace was at hand, except for that in Saigon, South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu refused to agree to them. The main opinion was that after fighting a war for South Vietnamese independence, the US was now handing power over to the Viet Cong. Kissinger tried to negotiate with both sides of the political divide, but to no avail. On December 16, 1972, the North Vietnamese pulled out of peace talks. Nixon was furious. In order to force the North back to the peace table, Nixon ordered Operation Linebacker II, the unrestricted bombing of North Vietnam. On December 18, 1972, 129 B-52 bombers, 52s. Operations resumed on December 26th with a massive aerial bombardment across North Vietnam, including in and around Hanoi and Haiphong. Greater support was given to the B-52s, including jamming aircraft such as the Navy's EA-6A, the forerunner to the famous EA-6B Prowler, and dedicated aircraft designed to seek out and destroy the radars guiding the SAMs, known as wild weasels. Widespread condemnation of the bombing, particularly when Hanoi showed pictures of a hospital that was caught up in the devastation, and claimed that 1,624 civilians had perished in the campaign. However, the North Vietnamese did agree to return to Paris, though they wished to make it clear that it was in the interest of peace and not because of the bombing. The North Vietnamese refused to change the terms they had agreed to in the earlier agreement, and this saw the same refusals from the South Vietnamese president. Nixon weighed in and threatened to have him deposed, and so with little choice in the matter, he agreed. On January 20th, 1973, the US signed the agreement as the Paris Peace Accords, and the next day a formal ceasefire was declared. Nixon had what he believed to be his peace with honor. The US wasted no time in withdrawing its last combat forces, and North Vietnam began releasing its US prisoners of war, including John McCain. Many of them were in extremely poor state, having endured years of physical abuse, and McCain himself had trouble raising his arms above his shoulder for the rest of his life. On March 29, 1973, the last US military unit left Vietnam, and on June 19th, Congress passed an act forbidding any future US involvement in military operations in Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos, while the US Navy began clearing away the mines it had laid off North Vietnam. From the 500,000 men in 1968, on December 31st, 1973, there were just 50 US service personnel in Vietnam. While Nixon had delivered on his promise to get the troops out, the fighting continued with sporadic battles between Viet Cong and ARVN forces. American troops would still find themselves caught up in these engagements, and 168 Americans died in Vietnam in 1973, despite the Paris Peace Accords. Neither side trusted the other, and frequently accused one another of breaking the peace accords, nor did the fighting show any signs of ending as 1974 dawned, and the situation was made worse for the South Vietnamese president when the US began withdrawing some of its financial support as it tried to distance itself from Vietnam as much as possible. After much deliberation, the Communist Party in Hanoi voted to attack South Vietnam again in a series of fresh offensives described as land grabs by the South Vietnamese. Their president was relying on the resumption of airstrikes by the US to defend his country, but Congress had tied Nixon's hands, and South Vietnam was now alone. Spurred on, the North Vietnamese launched a fresh offensive in March 1974, and began a rout of the ARVN. The ARVN did launch a successful counterattack against enemy positions in Cambodia, but the cost was so high, there was little to celebrate about. At the same time, the ARVN was being bled to death with mass desertions, while transporting supplies was disrupted by a flood of refugees on the roads escaping the fighting. In December 1974, the Communists defeated the ARVN just 75 miles northeast of Saigon, having struck from bases in Cambodia. The North Vietnamese waited for American intervention, but again nothing materialized. By that time, Nixon had been ousted as president following the Watergate scandal, and despite his desire to aid the South Vietnamese, newly installed President Gerald Ford was forbidding to by Congress. Believing there was nothing left to stop them, the North Vietnamese army prepared for yet another offensive in March 1975. They predicted the campaign to capture Saigon and secure South Vietnam would last around 2 years. The offensive began on March 10, 1975, but within a month the ARVN began to completely collapse, with 100,000 of them being taken prisoner. On April 4, 1975, the US began evacuating children out of South Vietnam to escape the fighting. Dubbed Operation Baby Lift, the first aircraft involved, a massive C-5 Galaxy, crashed on takeoff, killing 138 people, including 78 children. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong pushed on towards Saigon, and on April 21, 1975, the South Vietnamese president made a speech in which he blamed the United States for the fall of South Vietnam, before resigning and escaping to Taiwan. His successor, Tran Van Huong, would stay in office a week before resigning and handing the government over to General Duong Man Vinh, the same man who had overthrown President Diem in 1963. With Saigon surrounded, Vinh surrendered 2 days later on April 30th. At the US Embassy, there was a desperate effort to evacuate American staff and civilians to waiting US warships. Thousands of Saigon residents surrounded the embassy, hoping to get a ride on one of the evacuation helicopters, but few did. ARVN and South Vietnamese Air Force pilots often put their families aboard their military aircraft and flew out to the US ships, sometimes crashing them into the sea to force the American sailors to rescue them. The North Vietnamese would consolidate their hold on the South before formally unifying the country as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. To honour his memory, Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. The war fulfilled for several generations yet. 53,318 US service personnel would lose their lives in the war, and it would leave a profound impact on the US psyche, affecting